Close your eyes for a moment and imagine London in the spring of 1660. The air is heavy with smoke and the smell of rain-soaked cobblestone. Bells ring from every steeple, echoing through the city like a heartbeat that's been silent too long. Crowds fill the streets, merchants, beggars, noblemen, widows, all pressing toward the Thames, all waiting for one ship. For 11 years, England had no king. 11 years of Puritan rule under Oliver Cromwell, where laughter was forbidden, theaters closed, and even Christmas, a day of joy, was outlawed. It was a country starved not just of music and color, but of life itself. And now, that life was returning. As the ship Royal Charles cut through the waves toward Dover, a figure stood at its bow, his dark hair whipping in the wind. 30 years old, tall, long-limbed, with eyes that seemed to hold both charm and calculation, Charles Stuart was coming home. The prince who had fled across Europe during the English Civil War was now returning as King Charles II. He had survived betrayal, exile, poverty, and humiliation. He had begged foreign courts for shelter, gambled his last coins in taverns of Paris, and slept in peasant huts when soldiers hunted him through the woods. The son of the executed Charles the Firmters, the king beheaded before the jeering crowds, was about to reclaim the throne his father lost to steel and zealotry. When his ship docked on May 25, 1660, the crowd went mad. People wept, shouted, threw their hats in the air. Some even dropped to their knees as the new king stepped onto English soil. He smiled faintly, that half-smile that would come to define him, a mix of confidence and something darker, as if he already knew what this victory would cost. He promised forgiveness, peace, and restoration. But behind those promises was something deeper: hunger. Not the hunger of a ruler eager for reform or justice, but the hunger of a man who had been denied every pleasure for too long. He had tasted survival. Now he wanted indulgence. That night, London lit up. Torches lined the streets. Wine flowed through taverns like rivers, and fireworks painted the sky above the Thames. People danced in the mud, sang until their voices broke, and toasted to the merry monarch. Charles laughed among them, raising his glass high. But when he looked out over the sea of faces, he wasn't thinking of divine right or duty. He was thinking of what power really meant, how fragile it was, how it could vanish with a single sword swing or scandal. And that's why he decided he would never live like his father did, alone, fearful, bound by rules. His reign would be different. It would be about pleasure, about life, about taking everything the world had denied him. Whitehall Palace would no longer be a symbol of royal restraint. It would become the beating, reckless heart of a nation learning to sin again. The restoration had begun. And with it, so had the fall. Imagine an entire country waking up from a decade-long nightmare. That was England in 1661. The Puritans were gone. Their black coats, their bans, their sermons against laughter and lust. The people had lived too long under a government that treated joy as a crime. They were ready to breathe, to dance, to sin. Charles knew it. He could feel it in the air the moment he returned to London. The city pulsed like a living creature, hungry, restless, and ready to forget the years of silence. And the king fed that hunger. Within months of his coronation, theaters reopened. Musicians filled the taverns again. Masks, silks, and feathers returned to the streets. Women began to wear color, crimson, emerald, gold, as if trying to paint over the gray of the past. But it was in Whitehall Palace that the true rebirth began. The court of King Charles II, was nothing like the cold halls of his father. It was a place where rules bent like candle wax, ministers and mistresses mingled freely, poets whispered verses to duchesses, and every shadowed corridor seemed to hide a secret. Charles didn't just restore the monarchy, he reinvented it. To him, a court wasn't a council of statesmen. It was a theater of life, filled with actors, intrigues, and pleasures. Every night the palace came alive with music and perfume. The king's laughter echoed through the corridors while the firelight shimmered on velvet gowns and jeweled masks. People called him the Merry Monarch, but not just because he smiled. His court was a deliberate rebellion against hypocrisy, against shame, against the cold morality that had ruled England for too long. Still, behind the merriment was something deeper, a kind of desperation. Charles had seen too much death to believe in eternity. He had fled across fields while his father's blood still stained the scaffold. He had lived as a beggar among strangers, knowing that one wrong word could end his life. Pleasure to him wasn't just indulgence, it was survival. Eat, drink, and love, he once told his companions, for tomorrow the axe may fall again, and so they did. He surrounded himself with women, not just of beauty, but of wit and danger. Actresses, courtesans, and noblewomen competed for his attention. There was Barbara Palmer, bold and cruel, who could ruin a man's fortune with a smile. There was Nell Gwynn, the actress who rose from selling oranges in the theater pit to sharing the king's bed. And there were others, Frances Stewart, Louise de Querouaille, each a different reflection of the same hunger that burned inside him. He made them duchesses, gave them jewels, estates, and titles, but what he truly gave them was power. Because in the kingdom of Charles II, love could buy anything. At first, the people adored him for it. He was charming, generous, unpredictable. His wit made courtiers laugh and enemies hesitate. After years of iron Puritan rule, his laughter felt like light breaking through clouds. But as the years went on, whispers began to spread. That Whitehall Palace was no longer a court, but a brothel draped in gold. Behind the music and perfume, England's politics began to rot. Ministers plotted for influence through mistresses. Nobles bought power with bodies. Even the church, revived under the new king, could not wash away the stains of his nightly revels. And yet, the more they whispered, the more Charles smiled. He had already learned what his father never did. A king could survive scandal, but not boredom. He would rather be damned in history than forgotten. Step inside Whitehall Palace after midnight. The candles have burned low, the air thick with perfume, smoke, and the faint echo of a lute somewhere down the hall. The great mirrors shimmer in the dim light, reflecting faces flushed with wine, masks half removed, secrets whispered against painted lips. This is not a court, it's a world without daylight. At the center of it all sits King Charles II, dark-eyed, amused, and utterly unashamed. Around him, courtiers laugh too loudly. Women glide through the corridors in silks that rustle like sighs, and ministers pretend to discuss politics while staring at the nearest neckline. The king watches it all like a man studying a play, one he wrote himself. By 1663, his court had become legend. Diplomats wrote home in disbelief. The King of England, one French envoy reported, is ruled by his mistresses, and his council meets between the sheets. He wasn't entirely wrong. Charles had turned pleasure into politics. Every favor, every title, every secret could be traced back to one of his lovers. Barbara Palmer, Countess of Castlemaine, was perhaps the most notorious. With her sharp tongue and unmatched confidence, she ruled the royal bedchamber, and through it, half the realm. She flaunted her influence shamelessly. Ministers feared her, ladies envied her, and even the queen, poor, patient Catherine of Braganza, could do little but pray. Catherine had arrived from Portugal in 1662, a timid young woman with dark eyes and a dowry that promised peace between two nations. On her wedding night, she waited in her chamber, trembling, clutching her rosary as the city outside celebrated. But Charles never came. He was in the arms of another woman. It was the first of many nights she would spend alone. Yet Charles was not cruel. He visited her, smiled, and called her my dear little wife. But everyone in court knew that the queen was more a symbol than a spouse. While she prayed, the king danced. He once said, half in jest, "A dull wife makes a lively kingdom." Whitehall became a labyrinth of pleasure. Masked balls blurred into orgies. Masks became excuses for seduction, and courtiers discovered that the shortest path to royal favor was through satin sheets. At one infamous masquerade in 1664, the king appeared dressed as a shepherd, surrounded by women in glittering gowns, each pretending to be a nymph. Wine poured like rain, music swelled, and at dawn, when the candles burned down to wax stubs, the courtiers emerged from the palace with the stunned silence of people who had glimpsed both heaven and hell. Outside, London watched in fascination and disgust. Theaters began writing plays mocking the court's debauchery. Pamphlets described the king's harem in lurid detail. Yet no one turned away. They couldn't. The Puritans had starved the nation of desire. Charles had made it a feast. The people may have whispered about sin, but they were watching, and deep down, they envied him. Still, pleasure is a fragile crown. Beneath the laughter, something darker was beginning to stir. The streets of London were filling with tension. Disease, fear, and poverty creeping in from the alleys beyond the palace gates. For even the merry monarch couldn't dance forever while his kingdom began to rot. And soon, the laughter of Whitehall would be drowned by the sound of death itself. The year 1665 began like every other year in the reign of the merry monarch. Music, laughter, banquets that lasted until dawn. But the laughter began to sound hollow. A chill crept through the air that no fire in Whitehall could chase away. At first, it was only a rumor. A few deaths in the poorer districts of St. Giles. The physicians called it a pestilence of small nature. By May, it had a name everyone feared: the plague. Soon, the bells that once rang for coronations and feasts began to toll for funerals. Every hour, every street. The city of pleasure turned into a city of death. Charles watched it unfold from his palace windows. The same London that had danced for his return now burned with candlelight from 1,000 windows where the sick lay dying. The smell of smoke and decay replaced perfume. The merry songs that once filled taverns gave way to the cries of mothers, the clatter of dead carts. Yet even as death swept through the capital, Whitehall refused to sleep. The courtiers still gathered, though their laughter grew nervous. Dances continued behind closed doors, the music louder, faster, an attempt to drown out the silence outside. Some said the king's court was cursed. Others whispered that God had grown tired of England's sin. Charles himself fled to Oxford, taking his mistresses and musicians with him. He called it protecting the realm. But to many it looked like an escape. Back in London, entire families disappeared overnight. Grass grew between the cobblestones. Cats prowled through empty markets, and the sound of carts carrying corpses echoed through the alleys. Still, amid all this, the king's letters spoke of plays, dinners, and secret parties in the countryside. It wasn't that he didn't care, it was that he couldn't stop. He had built his life on pleasure. Without it, he would crumble. At Oxford, the parties continued, but something had changed in Charles. The charm was still there, but the jokes grew darker. One evening, as the wind howled outside, he turned to his companions and said quietly, "If death comes for us, he will find me smiling." It was bravado, but behind the mask, he was terrified. He had seen how quickly power vanished, how one moment you were a king, the next, a corpse abandoned in the streets. By autumn, London was a grave. The court returned cautiously the next year, stepping through a city that no longer knew laughter. But Charles would not stop. He rebuilt the theaters, reopened the taverns, and demanded new masks, new songs, new lovers. "If sin brought the plague," he said, "then I will sin again to drive it out." To his followers, it was defiance. To his critics, madness. But to Charles, it was faith. In life, in indulgence, in the fragile beauty of the moment. He believed that as long as he could feel, he was still alive. And that belief would lead him into the next storm. Because if the plague had shaken England's soul, what came next would burn it to ash. September 2nd, 1606, the night air was dry as bone. London slept beneath a sky full of smoke from summer hearths, unaware that in the bakery of Thomas Farriner on Pudding Lane, a single spark had escaped into history. Within hours, the city that had survived plague and war was ablaze. Flames leapt from timber to timber, devouring the narrow streets. Roofs caved, church bells melted, and the air turned red as molten glass. Charles II awoke to the sound of chaos. From his chambers in Whitehall, he could see the glow, an inferno spreading east to west, a serpent of fire coiling around St. Paul's Cathedral. The heat was so fierce it cracked the stones. For once, the merry monarch did not send others to face it. He rode out himself, boots splashed with ash, his long hair soaked with sweat. Eyewitnesses later wrote of a king transformed, not the lover, not the jester, but a commander shouting orders, forming human chains to carry water from the Thames. "Courage, my hearts," he cried. "We'll fight this devil yet." But the devil was unstoppable. For 4 days and nights, London burned. 70,000 homes vanished. The rich and the poor fled side by side, dragging what they could carry, silver, portraits, children, through the smoke. When it was finally over, the city was a skeleton of itself. The sky above London glowed ember red for weeks. Charles walked through the ruins in silence. No music, no laughter, no courtiers, just the smell of soot and the crunch of ash beneath his boots. The city mirrored him perfectly now, beautiful, ruined, and tired of pretending. Yet even here, amid the rubble, his instinct was to rebuild. He issued decrees for new streets, new churches, new order. He called for architects, men like Christopher Wren, to design a London worthy of rebirth. And while they planned, Charles returned to what he did best, keeping despair at bay with desire. He rebuilt his court faster than his capital. Within months, Whitehall was alive again with velvet and laughter. But now the mirth felt ghostly. Every jest echoed through corridors where half the servants had died of plague or fire. Every glass of wine tasted faintly of smoke. Still, the king smiled. He had outlived war, exile, pestilence, and flame, and he would outlive his own shame. Barbara Palmer was gone, replaced by a new favorite, Nell Gwynn, the golden-haired actress with a tongue as sharp as her laughter. She was everything the others were not, poor, witty, and openly honest about her place in his life. "I am the Protestant whore," she once joked when courtiers mocked her. The king roared with laughter. But even as new faces filled the palace, old whispers persisted. The court, they said, was more decadent than ever. While London rebuilt its bones, the king rebuilt his pleasures. And perhaps that was the point. Every act of indulgence was a declaration that life would continue, that beauty would bloom again from ash. For Charles, sin had become defiance, and the court, his battlefield. But history has its own way of collecting debts, and for all his charm, wit, and desire, the king who turned his palace into a brothel was about to learn that no man, not even a monarch, can cheat time. The shadow that had followed him since exile was returning, and this time, it wasn't wearing a mask. By the late 1660s, King Charles II had everything a man could want: wealth, loyalty, adoration, and a line of women whose names alone could cause a scandal to ripple through the entire kingdom. But beneath the glitter and laughter, Whitehall had become a war zone of silken daggers. His mistresses weren't just lovers, they were weapons. Barbara Palmer, now the Duchess of Cleveland, still prowled the palace with the arrogance of someone who had once ruled it. She bore the king 5 children and wielded their existence like a sword. Whenever Charles drifted toward another woman, Barbara reminded him that she carried the blood of his line. "You can change your bed," she once sneered, "but not your heirs." Her rival was everything she wasn't: innocent, radiant, untouchable. Frances Stuart, the woman poets called La Belle Stuart, refused to be anyone's mistress. She danced at the king's feasts, smiled at his compliments, and yet kept her virtue intact. That only made him want her more. One night, during a masquerade in 1667, Charles cornered her behind a curtain of golden fabric. "You could be a duchess by morning," he murmured. She looked at him, this man who had the power to destroy or elevate anyone in England, and whispered, "And you could be a husband if you were not already one." Then she turned and walked away. It drove him mad. When Frances fled the court to marry another man, Charles was devastated. He ordered her portrait hidden, then brought it back days later. "Let her stay," he told the artist. "I'd rather have her ghost than forget her face." But ghosts never travel alone. In the shadows of the court, others were waiting. Louise de Querouaille, the French spy with the face of an angel. Nell Gwynn, the actress with laughter louder than the king's conscience, and dozens of others whose names history swallowed in perfume and rumor. Each woman brought her own kind of danger. Louise whispered secrets in French and wore her piety like perfume. Light, deceptive, intoxicating. She came from the court of Louis XIV, and every smile she gave Charles was a message written for another king. Nell was her opposite, London's daughter, raised in poverty, barefoot one year and in silk the next. She teased Charles mercilessly, called him Charlie in front of the courtiers, and once told him, "You may be the king, but I'm the people's mistress." And strangely, she was right. The people adored her. They saw in Nell what they would never see in Louise or Barbara, a woman who loved their king not for his crown, but for his crooked smile and weary eyes. When mobs once mistook her carriage for the Frenchwoman's and began to shout, "Down with the papist whore!" Nell leaned out the window and shouted back, "Pray, good people, be civil. I am the Protestant whore." The crowd roared with laughter. The riot dissolved into applause. Even Charles laughed when he heard the story. But laughter didn't last. Because while his court drowned in love games and theater, the rest of England was quietly boiling. The wars with the Dutch had drained the treasury. The plague had left scars. The fire had devoured hope. And the king's nightly feasts seemed more obscene with every starving family that begged outside the palace gates. Parliament began to turn against him. Pamphlets mocked him as Old Rowley, a stallion who ruled from the bed instead of the throne. Preachers warned that God's wrath had not ended with the fire, that it was merely waiting for the right moment to return. Charles shrugged it off. He had learned long ago that repentance was for men who feared death, and Charles Stuart feared nothing, or at least that's what he told himself. Because sometimes, in the late hours before dawn, when the candles flickered low and even the laughter faded, he would wake drenched in sweat, dreaming of a crowd, of a blade, of his father kneeling before it. And the echo of that single swing would follow him into morning. By the mid-1670s, the glitter that once defined the Restoration had begun to rot. Whitehall still shimmered with candlelight, still pulsed with laughter, but beneath it all, a sickness grew. Not the plague this time. Something quieter, more dangerous, whispers. Parliament whispered about the king's debts. The clergy whispered about sin. The people whispered about the French gold that flowed through the hands of the king's favorites. And Charles listened, smiling, always smiling. But inside, he felt the ground shifting. He had promised peace, yet his foreign policy danced like his love life, between France and Holland, between loyalty and betrayal. Every treaty he signed smelled faintly of wine and Louise de Querouaille's perfume. Louis XIII called him mon cousin, but everyone knew what that meant. England was selling its soul to the Sun King. The people began to hate the glitter that once enchanted them. They saw the jewels on Louise's throat and smelled the hunger of taxation. They saw the masks and balls and heard the silence of empty stomachs beyond the palace gates. Even the streets changed. The laughter that once greeted the merry monarch now curdled into mockery. Children sang songs about the king's mistresses. Pamphleteers drew cartoons of him half-dressed, a crown slipping from his head as he reached for another woman. But Whitehall didn't stop. It couldn't. Night after night, the torches burned. The same masquerades, the same music, the same desperate denial. Charles drank, joked, touched the velvet hands of women who could destroy him with a sigh. And then came the storm he could not charm away. The Popish plot of 1678. It began with a lie, but lies spread faster than fire in a city built of fear. A hysterical informer named Titus Oates claimed that Catholics were plotting to assassinate the king and place his Catholic brother, James, Duke of York, on the throne. England, still scarred by civil war and haunted by plague, erupted in panic. Crowds filled the streets, demanding executions. Innocent men were dragged to the gallows, priests were hunted, and once again, London reeked of holy terror. Charles knew it was madness. He knew Oates was lying. But he also knew how fragile his rule had become. The same people who once danced for him might now cheer his death. For the first time in years, the king looked out from his window at a crowd that did not love him and felt the echo of his father's final mourning. He began to withdraw. The court still played, but the king no longer laughed as before. His eyes lingered longer on the flames in the fireplace, as if seeing the shape of his own ending there. Yet even now he refused to surrender his one constant faith, that life, in all its sin and splendor, was meant to be lived until the final breath. He told Nell Gwyn one night, when thunder rolled over London, "They call me faithless, perhaps they're right. But I have kept faith with joy, and that must count for something." She smiled sadly, tracing the lines of his aging hand. "Only if joy forgives you, Charlie." Outside, the rain struck the palace windows like an unending clock. The age of the merry monarch was dying. The crown was growing heavier, and somewhere beyond the walls of Whitehall, fate was waiting for the king who had outlaughed death too many times. By the 1680s, time had finally caught up with the merry monarch. His once dark hair had turned silver at the temples, his laugh quieter, slower. The mirrors of Whitehall still reflected beauty, but now it was painted over wrinkles and fatigue. The palace that once pulsed with life had grown heavy with memory. The perfume of vanished lovers, the echoes of music that no longer played. England, too, was changing. The Parliament Charles once toyed with now toyed with him. His brother James, the Duke of York, was heir to the throne and openly Catholic. That frightened the nation more than any war or plague ever had. Protestant mobs roamed the streets, chanting, "No popery, no papist king!" For the first time, Charles could not laugh the danger away. His body began to betray him. The long nights, the wine, the sleepless years of pleasure and anxiety had worn him thin. He suffered from convulsions, pain, sudden blackouts that left him gasping for air. But even when death crept closer, he hid it behind charm. In 1684, he threw what would be remembered as his final great feast, a masquerade that stretched until dawn. The courtiers wore silver masks, the chandeliers burned until wax pooled on the floor, and the king sat beneath a canopy of gold, surrounded by laughter that felt like mourning. When the musicians stopped playing, Charles rose slowly, his face pale in the candlelight. "We've all played our parts well," he said softly. "But remember, my friends, even the merriest mask must end." The next year, on February 2nd, 1685, he collapsed while dressing for the day. For 4 days, England held its breath as doctors bled him, burned him, forced him to swallow potions of pearl dust and syrup of toad. The court that once smelled of roses now stank of medicine and fear. On the morning of February 6th, the laughter that had ruled a nation fell silent. They say his final words were almost a joke. "Let not poor Nellie starve." Even dying, he thought of Nell Gwyn, the woman who made him feel human when the crown made him something else. He died surrounded by candles, their smoke curling upward like ghosts of every night he had lived too quickly. The courtiers wept, the priests murmured prayers, and for a moment, the kingdom seemed to hold its breath, waiting to see if even death would bow to the merry monarch. But it didn't. When they carried his body to Westminster Abbey, the crowds followed in silence. No cheers, no bells, no music, only the memory of laughter. Whitehall fell quiet. The mirrors gathered dust. The same walls that once shook with desire now heard only the wind. History would not forget him. Some called him the king who saved England from tyranny. Others, the man who drowned it in sin. But both were true. Charles II restored joy to a broken nation, and in doing so shattered every boundary that held it together. He made England laugh, love, and live again, but he also taught it how quickly pleasure turns to decay. Behind those gilded doors, he built a kingdom not of laws, but of longing. And when he died, He left behind not just an empire, but a question. Was he England's savior or its temptation? If you walk the corridors of the banqueting house in Whitehall today, you can still feel it, that faint pulse of forgotten music. The scent of wax and wine seems to hang in the air, and the portraits of Charles's mistresses still watch with sly, painted smiles. They say that on certain nights, when the moonlight hits the marble just right, you can almost see him. The tall figure with tired eyes and a half-smile, walking through the empty halls. A king who lived like a man trying to outdance time. A man who ruled his heart more than his crown. And perhaps that's why we still remember him. Because King Charles II didn't just restore the monarchy, he restored sin to the throne.